Well, hello everybody. Good morning to those of us in the Southern Hemisphere, and good afternoon and good evening to those in the North. Thank you for joining me today in this penultimate session of our 6-part series. I'll just wait a minute for a few people to check in. Here we have a lovely spring morning. It's been cold. The weather's been a bit chaotic. Heat waves to fires and big freezes all in one spring. So nice to see people checking in from around the world. Hello to some familiar names. Great. So today our theme for this session, we're going to be exploring this model of what's called the 10 Fetters, which is a very unique model of a map of looking at the fetters to awakening. And it's looking at this path of awakening as the Buddha described it, the path to the realization of Nibbana that can actually unfold in 4 stages, 4 distinct stages. And and these stages are marked by the falling away or the kind of the disappearance or the deactivating of these particular fetters. So we'll get more into that today. That's a really interesting topic. But this session I'm going to start with the guided meditation. Some previous ones we've done the talk and then the guided meditation. But today we'll start with the meditation. So get yourself into a posture that feels comfortable. We'll meditate for, say, 25 minutes or so. And I'll just give some guidance as we do that. After that, I'll give a talk on this particular subject that I mentioned. And then we'll have some time for live Q&A as usual through the chat box. Okay, so just settle yourselves into a comfortable position. I'm just going to pour some water. Okay, so for this period of meditation, refrain from using the chat box so we can all just settle into this guided meditation. So, having settled into a comfortable posture, it's good to just either lower your eyes or perhaps start with just lowering your eyes rather than closing your eyes. Just gently lower your gaze. And simply becoming more aware of your body, the sensations you're experiencing. in the body. Just the simple sensations of sitting, of breathing, recognizing the feelings of the particular posture you're in, how your arms are placed. If your back is upright, you can relax your shoulders a little so that the spine is upright without being tense or tight. And aware of your body in a particular space, the physical location it's inhabiting, the room you're in, not conceptually, but just recognizing in your peripheral vision the space of the room wherein the body is seated. Noticing the relative stillness of the body when we begin the meditation. And gently close your eyes if you feel comfortable to do so. And allow your attention to come more to the body itself, with the visual field disappearing, closing the eyes. We just look at what's present in awareness in terms of the body, in terms of sensation. And we can feel the movement of the breath, the weight of the body on the cushion or the chair, the floor. We can feel sensations of our arms, hands, legs, torso, spine. Sensations around the facial area, around the eyes, around the mouth. And coming to recognize the sensations of the breath, which can be felt as a more or less a continuity, a cascade of sensations as the body breathes in and out. A cascade of different sensations as each breath moves in and out of the body. So we just let the body breathe naturally. We don't try to force the breath in this particular kind of meditation. We don't force the breath to be any way other than it naturally is. So we notice, how is it? Sometimes the breath is slow and deep, and at times more shallow. You can feel the rising of the chest, the expanding of the lungs and the abdomen. On the in-breath, and their deflation on the out-breath. We still hear sounds around us, sounds in your own environment or what you can hear from the environment where I'm recording, the sounds of the birds, welcoming the sun. The sensations of the body coming and going with the various sounds, the sound of my voice. And of course, recognizing too what comes and goes in terms of mental movement, various thoughts may appear in the mind, perceptions, thinking. Just learn to recognize thought as thought, just like another sensory experience, like a sound or a body sensation. It appears for a moment, and if our attention doesn't pick it up and run with it, it disappears as quickly as it appears. So we just notice how thought appears and disappears. Thought at the sense door of the mind, sound at the sense door of the ears, sensation at the sense door of the body. All can be known with awareness, ever-present awareness. Which knows sound as sound, sensation as sensation, thought as thought, memory, images arising in the mind is just that. And our practice is to learn to recognize this awareness in order to allow that which arises within the field of awareness to just come and go. If we consider this ever-present natural awareness, which we can experience, which we know directly, is naturally present. It's not something we have to create. If we know it as a kind of a field a field experience within which these various impressions come and go, appear and disappear. And to help stabilize your attention, we can use this sensation of the natural sensation of the breath as it's felt in any moment to help stabilize attention in the present. Because our attention has been conditioned to jump around and latch on to different sense impressions. To get so involved and start thinking without recognizing what's happening. So for the purpose of meditation and cultivating mindfulness, present moment awareness, we use this sensation of the breath to touch into this moment, recognizing, knowing this sensation of the breath coming and going. So that's our stabilizing device, particularly when the mind gets busy or obsessed with a particular line of thinking. Come back to the breath, recognize the breath. Just knowing it. And then learning to rest attention in its source, awareness itself. And being patient with the momentum of the mind, the habit of the monkey mind, attention conditioned to flit here and there. Just simply notice what it knows and rest. Let it rest rather than run. It knows what it knows in the moment, and we can let it be. As the mind settles, attention will tend to take the finer objects of spaciousness and the field experience of awareness to recognize and be with. So these are more expansive perceptions, more restful for the mind, enabling the mind to let go, to not cling, to other thoughts or sounds or sensations. They still appear and disappear. If they do arise, but now the mind just knows them as fleeting impressions. Thought is just a mental impression. It can trigger a whole lot of perceptions, memories. Just recognize that and let it be, let it go. Don't cling, don't proliferate. It's just momentum. It's just the movement of mind, like the movement of the ocean when it's stirred up by the wind. It's just a movement to the mind. Don't fight it. And you find you can relax out of it. Always relying on present moment awareness here and now. It's always a bit of a dance that we're learning in meditation. A dance with the skills of calming the mind, allowing the mind to calm by recognizing certain aspects of experience, by seeing that any impression through the senses, it's always momentary. always changing, always a conditioned process. And our attention can either be caught up in that momentum through the various ways of desire and aversion, wanting and not wanting, pushing, pulling, selfing or identifying. Or you can recognize how that happens and recognize how that can be relaxed out of with that very seeing, with that recognition, knowing that awareness itself, naturally ever present, is that which can both recognize and be rested in, resting attention there. Allowing attention to rest back into its source. So the skills of seeing into vipassana, and relaxing, calming, samatha. These skills are working together. The two wings of meditation. Clear seeing and resting, relaxing out of momentum. And what feels like a stormy sea can suddenly change, just like that, to a calm, calm ocean. So whatever you find yourself experiencing now, just recognize that. And as we draw this meditation to a close, I encourage you just to bring your attention more towards your breath, or more to recognize the experience of the in-breath and the out-breath. And as we come out of the meditation, perhaps taking a slightly deeper in-breath And out breath, letting go, coming into this shared space of the live stream. Okay. So that was a little more than 25 minutes. Seemed to go pretty fast. But I hope those instructions, that guidance was helpful for you. And I encourage you to come back to these guided meditations from time to time. Because what you hear at one time, there's layers to these things. You can hear different things at different times. And the instructions are something that can always help you find again that centering place. So especially at those times that you might feel overwhelmed with the movement of the mind, and you might not feel like sitting, but actually just sitting with a guided meditation can really help. Okay. So, to talk about our particular theme today. So far in the series, we've covered the Four Noble Truths. We've looked into the Eightfold Path. In the third session, we looked more specifically at the 5 aggregates, or the 5 khandhas. Khandhas affected by clinging, and the 3 characteristics of existence, or the 3 characteristics of conditioned phenomena. And you'll see that within my talk today, all of these things will come together as we look at these 4 stages of awakening through this model of the 10 fetters. The 10 fetters that bind us, they're called the fetters that bind us to the cycle of samsara, which is repeated rebirth, repeated cycles of existence that reap more suffering and unsatisfactoriness. So habitual cycles of suffering in deluded states of being. So many of you may have, being practitioners, will have heard of these 4 stages of awakening. In the early Buddhist model, we've got, I'll just name it so we can map out this territory. The first stage of awakening is called sotapanna, or stream entry. The sotapanna is a stream enterer, or has attained stream entry. The second stage is sakadagami. These are the Pali terms, which means a once returner. I'll come back to explain this. The third stage is the anagami, or the non-returner. And the 4th stage or attainment is the full awakening, where one fully realizes nibbana, fully realizes the deathless. One has, it's said, the destruction of the taints, or the asavas in Pali, is attained at that stage. And there is obviously no falling back, no more rebirth in samsara. So these 4 stages, and this is the Arahant stage. With the attainment of stream entry, I'm just going to map this out in terms of the 10 fetters, and then I'll come back and explain it, just so as you have a mind map of what we're going to talk about today. So for the Sotapanna, the stream enterer, it's said with a particular insight, they enter the stream of Dharma, so that their full liberation is absolutely assured. With this insight, what's sometimes called the first glimpse of the deathless, a glimpse of Nibbana through their contemplative understanding or their insight, meditative insight, they now have a glimpse, a direct glimpse of Nibbana. It's not stabilized, but there's something that has seen and knows the deathless or the unconditioned reality. And this has brought perspective onto the conditioned reality, the experiential world of phenomena. And with this particular insight, the insight is really a depth insight into seeing that all phenomena, all conditions are impermanent and not self. This is the essence of it. And as we see in that first discourse of the Buddha, which I talked about in the first session, the first disciple of the Buddha to realize stream entry was called Kondanya. And he came to be known as Ayya Jitindriya, Kondanya who knows, because at the end of that discourse, the Buddha says, Kondanya knows. Kondanya had the insight, as the Buddha taught, around his own realization of the Four Noble Truths. He had this insight that all that arises ceases. All phenomena, because phenomena, experience arises, it also ceases. So there's this more globalized insight that anything that arises is conditioned. If it arises, it ceases. It's like saying whatever is born must die, because that is the nature of having been born, of having taken on a body or a form. Then within that very condition, there is the demise of that form. And this can be verified through your own direct experience and contemplation with any aspect of nature externally, from the minutest atom to the sun, the cosmos. It's actually whatever is born, it has a lifespan. It will move towards death and decay. This is the nature of the conditioned realm. And internally, through the contemplative understanding, we see this very same pattern with all phenomena that arises in awareness. All that appears disappears, all that arises ceases. So this is a depth insight. We can actually understand this intellectually and intuitively know the truth of it without necessarily having a direct glimpse of the deathless. So this insight is still moving you, this understanding, I should say, is still moving you towards this first stage of awakening. But it's with that first glimpse of the deathless. It can be momentary, it can be sustained a little longer, But this is what's called the Sotapanna insight. And it's actually said that with this insight, the being who has realized this is bound for full awakening, full realization in no more than 7 lives. So this is the particular of the Sotapanna insight. Now that person who has that understanding may indeed gain the other stages of awakening within this very life, or they may not. So a maximum 7 more lives. And there are different kinds of Sotapannas in terms of the depth of their wisdom and understanding. You find in the suttas sometimes there's a little more clarification that someone might gain a Sotapanna insight, gain that stage of awakening, and may have just, less than 7 lives before full realization. But this very much depends on how the life of that person and their practice and their dedication to cultivating this insight through practice, how that develops. And of course, the karmic propensity that supports that being, whether or not they need a full 7 lives or less. I think only a Buddha could know what's possible. Anyway, so that is the Sotapanna. And for the Sotapanna, what falls away or what gets cut away are these first 3 fetters. The first 3 fetters are what's called personality view or identity view. Skeptical doubt is the second, and attachment to what we call sila bhatta paramasa, and it gets translated as attachment to rules and rituals, and I'll explain a little bit more on what that is talking about. I'll come back to that. So the second stage of awakening, the once returner. And what that means is with this second stage of awakening, they have maximum just 1 more life to full realization. A once returner. And what they have seen through and have cut away in terms of the fetters, the 4th and the 5th fetter, is attachment to sense pleasure or sensual desire. You get different translations. And aversion. So they haven't cut those away fully, but the grosser forms of those have subsided or have been seen through. They no longer fetter the once returner. But they have not yet been fully seen through, not yet been fully allayed. The finer forms of sense desire and aversion can still fetter the once returner. Nevertheless, the grosser forms have been seen through, no longer fetter that person. So not until the next stage, the 3rd stage of non-returner, do the 4th and the 5th fetter of sensual desire and aversion get fully allayed or seen through. So for the non-returner, those first 5 of the 10 fetters have been allayed, seen through. They no longer fetter the non-returner. So what's this non-returner? So it actually means that the way it's said in the suttas is that this person who's realized the path of and fruit of the non-returner. They're not going to be reborn in what we call the desire realm. The Buddha says at the end of this life, they take birth in the pure abodes, and from there attain full awakening. The pure abodes sounds like some kind of pure heavenly kind of realm, but it's not one of the heavenly realms within the cosmology of the Buddhist cosmology in terms of Deva realms or God realms. It seems to be within the suttas, these pure abodes are those abodes of non-returners. So they seem to have a special abode. That's if they don't realize full awakening, full arahantship in this very life. But quite often they do. So the non-returner, if on the death in this life they don't realize full awakening, then there's rebirth in the pure abodes. The karmic, whatever karmic propensity there is naturally exhausted, and then full awakening is realized from there. So that means the last 5 fetters are really the domain on the path of arahantship, from non-return to arahantship. The last 5 fetters. So what are they? So that's attachment to what we call fine material existence, attachment to immaterial existence. So that's 6 and 7. And these usually get explained as referring to attachment to the fine states of mind in jhana, in samadhi. Fine material existence refers to the levels of the first 4 jhanas, and attachment to immaterial existence. That's the formless states, the very fine states of mind that are inherently pleasant. There's still attachment to the pleasures of the fine material realm and the immaterial realm, or the formless realm. So these aren't considered sensual pleasures, because the sensual pleasures are considered the pleasures derived through seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching, the 5 chords of sense pleasure, and the desire that's bound up with seeking gratification in these ways. So the non-returner has seen through that, cut through that, has no more desire in that sense, but there is attachment to the subtle pleasures of the mind, refined states of mind that aren't to do with sensuality, but are nevertheless, there's the attachment. And even often in suttas, when the Buddha is teaching, he'll give a teaching and say, this is a way to practice to realize arahantship. Or if you don't realize arahantship, you'll realize the state of non-returner. It's because of that desire and pleasure one gains even from the Dhamma itself, the desire and delight in the Dhamma can actually hold you back from the realization, the full awakening. So this is also a fine material, or a fine kind of pleasure, delighting in the Dhamma itself. So even that, as wholesome as it is, if that's not seen and understood, it forms a place of clinging for the mind. Yeah, so that's interesting, huh? So beyond this attachment to fine material and immaterial experience or existence, the last 3 fetters, we have restlessness, conceit, and ignorance itself as the 10th fetter. So these last 5 are what get worked with and eventually seen through and cut through on the path of Arahantship. And then the fruit of Arahantship, these things have been utterly allayed or seen through. And with the realization of Arahantship, the full realization of Nibbana, it's said always, almost always, it's articulated in the suttas that the asavas, the outflows, these habitual outflows of the mind, of delusion, of becoming, of ignorance, of becoming, of views and of desire, they're completely cut away. These are the asavas. So the declaration of the Arahant is that the asavas have been destroyed. So the asavas is a funny word, and it gets translated in many ways. It's sometimes called the cankers, or an old translation is the floods, the impurities of mind, or the outflows, or the influxes. Effluence. These are 6 different translations for asavas. The early ones, the floods, and they all mean something slightly different, but rather unwanted. But floods, the word floods is interesting. So these are like impulses based in ignorance, views, desire, and becoming. They're impulses that flood. You could think of it as flooding the system and creating delusion, creating clouding the vision. And until these are seen through, there's not a clear vision, and there's not freedom, full freedom from the asavas and the underlying tendencies. So this is the map of the 10 fetters. It's quite a unique map. Now, for a being who's practicing in the Buddha's dispensation, they're not necessarily going to go through all of these 4 stages distinctly, but often in the suttas you see that they are at one or other of these stages. But for example, in that first discourse of the Buddha, the Dhammacakka Sutta, and we had Kondanya, the only one of those 5 disciples who realized Sotapanna, realized the stage of Sotapanna. So the other 4 didn't. They might have understood, they might be getting closer to what the Buddha's talking about. But in the following discourse, which is, as far as I understand, wasn't too long after this first discourse, and I believe it was in Atthallakkhana Sutta, where the Buddha continued to teach these 5 disciples. They all gained full awakening by the end of that teaching. So we have Kondanya coming from Sotapanna to realize full awakening all at once, and then the other 4 seemingly going from not having the Sotapanna to full awakening all at once. So the full awakening can, obviously through these examples, at least in the Buddha's time, can happen all at once. And probably for those beings who are very primed and have a lot of low-hanging fruit, ripe fruit that's just ready to drop, right, with the right teaching, with the right angle. So their spiritual faculties are really well developed. But there are many others, and this is more the usual case in the Buddha's suttas, where the Buddha gives a teaching and people realize stream entry, the first stage. They've understood, they had the first glimpse of the deathless. They understand this insight into anicca, the conditioned, the impermanent, changeable nature of conditioned reality. They've had a taste of the deathless, the unconditioned. So this is the usual. And from there, they may progress. They may not realize any further stage in their life, or they may then realize once return or up to non-return, or in that very life. In fact, many of the Buddha's disciples realized stream entry on the first teaching they heard of the Buddha, and by the end of their life, or at some stage in their life, had realized full awakening. There's a couple of little stories I can share with you to kind of illustrate some of this. And one interesting one is that Ananda, who was the Buddha's attendant for a long time through the Buddha's teaching career, and Ananda, who's so close to the Buddha, and he was with the Buddha so often, he heard so many of the teachings, and he was the one after the Buddha's death who was able to recall all the teachings that he heard, for these teachings to be collated and chanted and remembered, to be passed down through the generations. So he had a really powerful mind and fantastic karma to live so closely to the Buddha. And yet he only was a Sotapanna, even though that's great. But he remained a Sotapanna until even after the Buddha's death. So all these other great disciples of the Buddha are realizing non-return or arahantship. And Ananda, the one who is closest to the Buddha, still only has the level of understanding of a Sotapanna, even though he has other profound qualities, great mindfulness to remember these teachings, and access to the Buddha, so much access to the Buddha. So Ananda didn't realize the full awakening until after the Buddha passed away. And on a few occasions, he was somewhat chastised affectionately by the Buddha, because Ananda had seemed to have this love of community and delighted a lot in community. And the Buddha was really encouraging him to be careful about that, delighting in company, that this is how it was put in the suttas, that he should focus more in seclusion on his practice to realize the full awakening. And Ananda took those chastisements, very well and to heart. But of course, he had this love of spiritual friendship and delighted. So even that delight in the Dharma, this is what I was saying earlier, can inhibit the full awakening. It's not a bad thing, but if we don't see the attachment, then it can become a fetter. Anyway, Ananda was quite devastated with the death of the Buddha, quite naturally so. And so that really urged him on. After the Buddha's death, he strived very hard in his practice to try to come to full awakening. Also because it was said they were going to have a meeting of all the Arahants after the Buddha died, in order to ratify the Buddha's teachings. And of course, Ananda was the one who remembered most of the teachings, but not being an Arahant, apparently he wasn't going to be eligible for this particular meeting, which is really interesting predicament in the story that we have. And so that really urged him on to try to realize the full awakening. And the story goes that he strove so hard, he was quite exhausted on the eve of this meeting of the Arahants that was going to take place. And he actually came to the point where he thought, it's not going to happen, And he just let go and thought, okay, well, is as it is. and was going to take a rest. And apparently, before his head hit the pillow, he realized the full awakening. He realized Nibbana, and his heart was completely released. So the good news is he was now eligible for this meeting, which was great. But there's an interesting lesson in that. Although with all his striving and his great desire to realize the Dhamma, it was only at that point where he backed off and let go that the fruit of understanding, that his heart was released, and that fruit of the full understanding emerged. There's a bit of a lesson in there for all of us. And often this does come out in teachers' stories of their own awakening. They can strive, and at a certain point, something needs to relax before a liberating experience emerges. Because there's something within that striving which is still driven by desire, wanting, directed through thought, through an idea or a view. It's not that it's bad practice, but when that is relaxed, the fruit of the practice which has cultivated those spiritual faculties can ripen, can come to fruition. There's a letting go that brings one to full fruition. So another interesting story in that regard. This is about Sariputta, who was one of the Buddha's chief disciples. He became fully awakened early on. He and Moggallana, who was the other chief disciple, they actually heard of the Buddha's teaching from one of the first 5 disciples who had fully awakened. But upon hearing just one sentence of what the Buddha was teaching from that disciple, Sariputta attained stream entry. Now that teaching, I can't remember the name of that disciple. I think it might have been Assaji. And Sariputta, who was a Brahmin student, quite mature Brahmin student, he was impressed by seeing Assaji on alms round, and he stopped him and asked, or he followed him and asked, "Who is your teacher? What does he teach?" And this monk said, "Well, the Buddha, can't teach you the perfection of the Buddha's teaching, but what he teaches is the causes of all causally arisen things and the way to their cessation too." It was just on that sentence that Sariputta attained stream entry. Hearing about the causes of all causally arisen things and the way to their cessation. So there's some insight there into arising and ceasing, the conditioned and the unconditioned. What arises ceases, this same Sotapanna insight. Now Sariputta became very excited and wanted to go and see the Buddha directly, and he told his friend, his brother, I forget what his name was before he was Moggallana, but he told him what he'd heard from Assaji, Venerable Assaji. And on hearing that, Moggallana too became a stream enterer. So that's interesting, isn't it? They were both very ripe in their spiritual faculties. Not a direct teaching from the Buddha, but hearing teaching from an awakened being. about impermanence and conditionality and the possibility of cessation, of not only seeing the cessation of conditions, but realizing the fullness of the conditioned and the unconditioned. So he and Moggallana then went to see the Buddha and became the Buddha's disciples. I think within a week, Moggallana had attained arahantship, but Sariputta said took the long route. 2 weeks it took him, something like that, to attain full awakening. This is the story, the narrative that's come down to us. But anyway, in a short time, they both attained awakening. So they were the chief disciples. Now, Sariputta, this story I wanted to tell you, which relates to the fetters. I think it was someone, a monk called Anuruddha, who came to Sariputta. Now, Anuruddha was purportedly already a non-returner, a very highly accomplished practitioner. But he came to Sariputta and he said, friend Sariputta, he had the divine eye, so he had psychic powers, Anuruddha. He said, with the divine eye, I can see into all these different realms and worlds. And my energy is strong and unremitting. My mindfulness is perfectly balanced, and there's equanimity, and I have great concentration. All these factors are there, and yet I still haven't realized the full awakening. I still haven't realized the end of clinging. So he's a non-returner, and he's asking Sariputta about this. He's obviously well accomplished. So Sariputta says to him that what you say about your divine eye, Anuruddha, that is conceit in you. And what you've said about your energy and your strong energy and your clear mindfulness and your one-pointed concentration, that's actually restlessness in you. And when you talk about not having attained the full awakening yet, that's actually worry in you. So it would be good if you could abandon these 3 states. And so Anuruddha went away and practiced with this to recognize the conceit, the restlessness, and what Sariputta points out as worry, which is often associated with restlessness and worry. So he saw these states even through that kind of, even as a non-returner, he couldn't see that there's still this striving which created restlessness. He knew that there were still these taints, another word for asavas, impurities of mind. He hadn't realized full release. There was still clinging, but he didn't know where or how that clinging was happening. So Sariputta points out these fetters, particularly conceit and restlessness, and a part of that is worry, to look at how he's conceiving of himself and his practice, and how that's creating subtle restlessness, subtle attachment, and this idea of I've got to get somewhere. And when he saw that clearly, in a short time, it said, he realized full arahantship, full awakening. Such is the blessings of awakened spiritual friends, to point out to you where the clinging still needs to be seen and investigated. So another little story. I hope you're still interested, and we'll see by your questions later. About the Buddha's cousin, Mahanama. He was a layman. I think he held some kind of very responsible role in the community. So he was purported by this time, about the engagement that I'll let you know, he was purported to be a once returner. So he'd tasted the deathless. He has that realization of sotapanna, and those first those fetters, the fourth and fifth fetter of sensual desire and aversion, are somewhat assuaged for the once returner, but not fully assuaged. So he asks the Buddha, when the Buddha's visiting him at some point, he said, I do understand that the khandhas, the aggregates of form, feeling, perception, mental formations, sense consciousness, are not self, that all conditions are impermanent. I understand this, and yet still sometimes desire, aversion, and delusion can arise in my mind and hang around for a bit. And Mahanama didn't understand why this was happening, why this should be so. And the Buddha simply said, well, yes, that's right. The reason they're hanging around is because you still haven't realized a pleasure that transcends the sensual pleasures. So this is a very interesting teaching. So what he's saying is Mahanama hasn't cultivated the jhanic states, or hasn't realized to the depth that he can dwell in a state, say, that is refined pleasure, that is not to do with the sense pleasures, the 5 chords of sense pleasure, and that not realizing that pleasure which goes beyond being able to dwell in the fine material, in the jhanas, for example, or in the fruit, being able to have the mind that knows how to bring about the dwelling in the fruit of sotapanna. He's not yet able to stabilize that, so his mind is still swayed, and there's still some clinging to the sensual pleasures, the 5 sense chords of sense pleasure. So even as a once returner, there's still that capacity, that propensity to come back to the sense world or the desire world because of that attachment. So it seems to be indicating that one of the transitions, so certainly the transition for the non-returner, seems to be indicating the non-returner would probably have this capacity to dwell at least in a level of first jhana samadhi, or the fruit, know how to come into the fruit of liberation depending on that level of awakening, which is just remembering again the deathless element. So I thought that was an interesting story, just to say that this layman, who I believe was a cousin of the Buddha, was quite realized, once returner. And the Buddha's just pointing out, you haven't yet found that pleasure that transcends sense pleasure. Even the delight in the Dhamma transcends that sense pleasure. And that is the attachment, the clinging that needs to be seen through, or at least seen and known and understood. for the non-return insight to fruit. So I hope that gives you some sense of how these four paths interact with these 10 fetters. They're an entwined model of awakening. And for this last 10, 15 minutes or so, I just want to come to these first three fetters to explain a little bit more, because this is where most of us are working to realize stream entry is said to actually close the gates to lower rebirth. It sets one, unconditionally bound for full awakening. So we need to understand what these three fetters are about. So Sakkaya Ditthi, personality view or identity view, skeptical doubt, and attachment to rules and rituals. It's one translation, Silabbata Paramasa. So we've been actually talking throughout this whole session, not this session, but all this series, about the five khandhas and the five khandhas affected by clinging. That's what it's called, upadana khandha. Form, physical form, feeling, perception, mental formation, sense consciousness. These are the five khandhas groups affected by clinging. So this is the territory, and I've talked about the khandhas in many ways, wherein as our understanding deepens, the insights, the understanding will ripen and insight will occur. So identity view or personality view is the belief, the unquestioned belief that these five khandhas are me, mine, or what I am. So it's called identity view, the view that I am this body, I am the feelings, the perceptions, the mental formations, the sense consciousness that I experience. This is me, this is mine, or this is what I am in these three forms, me, I, mine. So this is the territory of practice, as I've mentioned many times previously, to begin to discern what are these khandhas. It's not just an idea, we have to get a mental map of it first, but just as in all these guided meditations, we learn to recognize sensation as it appears in the mind. Sensation is the form khandha. The form khandha is to do with the four elements, internally or externally. Any form, material form, is made up of the four elements of earth, water, fire, air, or the other way of talking about that is in its characteristics, solidity, fluidity, the thermal qualities, the qualities of extension or movement, the air quality. So we can recognize the form element through these characteristics and just know it as the form element. Yeah, the form khandha. So any time we recognize sensation connected with the body, we're recognizing, we're seeing the form khandha and the four elements in their various displays. The feeling khandha is that hedonic sense of pleasure or pain, pleasantness or unpleasantness on that scale. Whatever we experience, there is a feeling tone connected with that. We need to learn to discern this quality of feeling or Vedana, whether it's feeling connected with the body or feeling connected with mental experience. Pleasure, it can be felt on the scale of from unpleasant to pleasant. We can know that moment of feeling. the aggregate of feeling. And why it's important to know this aggregate of feeling is because actually this is a lot where attachment and clinging happens, because of the habitual push-pull that happens with pleasure and pain. Yeah, particularly pain, there's this resistance or unpleasantness. We're so habituated to not wanting, getting away from, and pleasantness, we're so habituating to indulging and, you know, just wanting, clinging more, not wanting to lose. So just, Buddha said that feeling is just like a bubble, a raindrop touching a puddle, and this little bubble pops up. Feeling is so brief and transient, but we don't see it. The delusion in the mind, we don't see it. There's the clinging. I, me, mine, I want, I don't want. So we need to see past that habitual activity just to see what is that quality of pleasantness or unpleasantness, and the clinging which goes wanting, not wanting. We just need to see that as it is, as the characteristics at play around this khandha of feeling tone. Perception, the images that arise in the mind as memory or word labels, identifiers, signifiers. This is the khandha of perception. Similarly, the mind is habituated to owning and identifying with perception as me. This is really me, this is mine, what I see and perceive is true and correct, and it's really telling me real things about the world, rather than just seeing those conditioned moments of perception, learned labels, conditioned images of the mind, conveying data to the mind, and then we build up our thoughts and views dependent on that, not seeing the conditioned and fleeting nature of perception. Perception, the Buddha said, is like a mirage. You know, the mirage, you're looking into the distance and the heat waves create an impression. You think you see an oasis, trees, water, and out of that belief in that illusion, you're hankering after something. But it's just literally, it's just an impression. It doesn't really exist in and of itself. So we have to see the impermanence and fleeting nature of perception. Mental formations, any mental movement, but pointing particularly to formed concepts, ideas, views, memes, fully blown emotions, mind states. These are mental formations. To see them as such, equally fleeting. And the Buddha said sankhara, or mental formations, are like a plantain stem, which is a banana tree. And apparently, I've never done this myself, but apparently you peel back the outer layers of the outside of a banana tree, and you peel it all back, and there's nothing in the middle. There's no heartwood. So it's completely hollow. So the Buddha compared sankharas to this plantain stem, hollow. We really think this is me, this is mine, this is what I am. The mind states, the emotions, the ideas, the views, they are all conditioned. They all come to be through various interacting conditions, the way we've been conditioned in this life and past lives and culturally. We don't see it as just that. They're equally as impermanent, fleeting, and coreless. There's no heart to them. There's no real me or mine in it. And as we start to see them as impermanent, changeable, we recognize they're not who and what we are. They come and they go. But when there's grasping and clinging, you know, we collect them, we hold them. And they literally almost build up this sense of solidity, but that's just an impression. If we look directly at them, thoughts, views, notions, concepts, what are they? Momentary mental formations, now here, now gone. Sense consciousness, the fifth khandha to be investigated. It's just any experience, a moment of cognition or consciousness that arises through seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching, thinking, or knowing through the mind, any of this sense data. That moment of cognition, of, we can call it experience, is just that. It's also anicca. It's dukkha. It's not satisfactory. It's not going to give you lasting pleasure, even if it's a very pleasant experience. Does it stay that way? It's so momentary, and that's all we have to see. When we see it's anicca, the depth of that realization can take us to the realization of anatta. This is not self. All that is changing and fleeting, all that arises, ceases. It's not a me, not a mine, as a permanent essence, as a permanent thing. We're not denying the experience, but we're seeing it as a process of conditioned experience. It's not a solid me, a solid mind, a solid entity that has some unchanging reality to it. So these are the five khandhas, which is the main practice, the main territory of insight. Once we really see through our meditative contemplation and understanding, once the penny drops, you see these are changing conditions. You see how the imputation of I, of me, of mine is a mere habit, a conditioned habit. When you see these things as very fleeting, momentary impressions in a process, in a continual process, and when the mind, at least momentarily, sees that so clearly and rests out of it, or with the seeing so clearly, the clinging drops away. It's in that moment where one can recognize not self, the empty nature, the emptiness of self, the emptiness of a permanent, abiding entity within that process. At the same time, one recognizes the unconditioned. And this is the stream entry insight. So that path of stream entry, it really is about cultivating that perception of impermanence. It doesn't mean overlaying an idea of impermanence, but investigating reality, whether externally or internally or both, investigating experience, investigating phenomenal experience. Is it permanent? Is it satisfactory? Can it bring lasting pleasure? Is it an unchanging entity that's worthy of being called I, me, or mine? Worthy of taking to be I, me, or mine? Because when you see the mind taking it to be I, me, or mine, the instant result is dukkha. When this is seen clearly, the clinging is abandoned. It's a natural response to that clear seeing. So this is where identity view is allayed. It doesn't mean one isn't, doesn't experience let's say, a sense of self, but one no longer is taken in to the extent you have been before. You know, you've seen, and so you practice to keep allaying that false assumption, letting go, allaying it. Where you see that suffering arising, you're allaying the clinging, and you're working to contemplate these khandhas in order to come to the complete abandoning. So just briefly, skeptical doubt, as long as we haven't clarified the conditioned and the unconditioned through our own insight, as long as we haven't clarified anicca, dukkha, anatta with regards to the khandhas, there's still that doubt because we haven't seen it directly. We might understand intellectually and have faith, but until that direct seeing for oneself and the taste of the deathless, there will still be that potential to doubt. But to see the doubting mind is also very important, to learn to recognize the wavering mind and relaxing out of that. That's looking at doubt as a hindrance. The third fetter, to briefly mention, attachment to rules and attachment to rules and rituals, it often gets called. So traditionally this is talked about as a belief that just behaving in a certain way, with following certain rules and rituals, just that in and of itself will has the potential to liberate you. So whatever those rules or rituals may be, in whatever tradition, just performing certain rules or rituals, the Buddha said, to believe that they will liberate you in and of themselves is a fetter. It doesn't happen that way. It happens through insight, through understanding the nature of reality. Now, it doesn't mean that certain ways of behaving aren't worth following. They certainly are, when we talk about the 5 precepts, for example, or the 10 precepts, or the precepts of monastics. These are worth cultivating because they're wholesome and they avoid the actions that lead to suffering for oneself and others. And they create the conditions of calm to support insight in the practitioner. So these are really helpful conditions, but to believe that a certain way of practice will liberate you is a fetter. In the Buddha's day, many practitioners believed in lots of different things, and I think this was really important that the Buddha was pointing out. It's not just, bathing in a particular holy water that's going to liberate you. It's not just performing rituals that's going to liberate you. It's really to do with insight and understanding the nature of reality, which brings about liberation. And this you can verify for yourself, whereas certain rituals just rely perhaps on faith, not direct insight. So one thing I wanted to bring into this, though, is the fact that Ajahn Sumedho talks very interestingly of these 2 fetters, on doubt and attachment to rules and rituals, which is really worth our considering. And there's a lot of insight there. And he points to the fetter of doubt as being related to thinking. The more you think, the more you doubt. The more you doubt, the more you think. So it's not just that perhaps we haven't attained a vision of the deathless ourselves, but thinking in itself, belief in thinking, can actually support or keep that fetter of doubt in place. So to start to notice how thinking can lead to doubt and doubt can lead to thinking. And the third fetter of attachment to rules and rituals he talks about as cultural conditioning and including the conditioning of language, but cultural conditioning, how we're so blinded by our cultural conditioning. We can see this the world over, where attachment to views and cultural conditioning leads to conflict over and over and over and over and over again. Cultural conditioning also includes religious conditioning, any kind of conditioning in terms of what we think is how it should be or how we should behave, because that's the way our culture says is right. So just to be able to reflect on these conditioning elements that actually can create structures in the mind, just like language can create structures in the mind that go unquestioned. But when we start to investigate the conditioning of language and of cultural conditioning in all its aspects, it can bring amazing insight and be very freeing. So that's quite a long talk, a bit over an hour, to cover this territory. It never seems enough. I really feel like I managed just to map it out rather than give a lot of more discursive reflections on the territory, but your questions can bring out some more discursive reflections. So let's open up the chat for some Q&A and we'll see how we go. So please feel free to pop in your reflections or comments or questions, and I'll do my best to respond to them. And of course, we have a bit of a delay between you putting in your questions and me actually seeing it. And then as I work through the questions, just be aware that if you're putting in further questions, I might still be, halfway through the chat and not seeing them until a little bit later. So how are we going? Are people still with me? What did you glean from the meditation and the talk? So someone says, why did I experience colors during the meditation? It's just part of what happens. Sometimes when you close your eyes, you can see different colors and shapes. Sometimes when the mind is becoming more one-pointed, more concentrated or coherent, sometimes that can give rise to what seems like certain colors in the mind, luminosity in the mind. People see different things. It's nothing to be too concerned about, but just notice that can be part of the experience. So David says, I've heard stream entry described as the release of an ocean of suffering. Yes, well, I think, the Buddha is a master at metaphor and analogy. And as I recall in one of the suttas, well, there's many little suttas actually, he says, I think this is one I remember. He said, if you, scrape at the earth with your fingernail and you get a bit of earth under your fingernail. He said to the monks, so what's greater, this grey earth or the amount of dirt under my fingernail? And they say, well, Lord, the grey earth is much greater than the amount of dirt under your fingernail. And he said, and so it is. Just like that grey earth, that's the amount of suffering that a Sotapanna has abandoned. And what's under his fingernail, that's the amount of suffering that they have to work through to get to the full awakening. And he had lots of different analogies in that same vein, and one was probably with regards to the ocean. You know, the vastness of the ocean is similar to what the Sotapanna had, the amount of suffering the Sotapanna has left behind, compared to, say, I'm not sure what the analogy is in the suttas, but compared to, say, just a little bit of water in a glass left to go. So it's pretty massive. So this is why it's quite important to contemplate these first three fetters and really study personality, what's called Sakkaya Ditthi, identity view, personality view, in terms of clinging. It's clinging to the five aggregates, to study how that happens, how that appears, how it is in your own direct experience. Which means first getting to know what are these khandhas. You know, this is a paradigm from ancient India. So we have to learn what that means first in our own experience. But then once you recognize those things, what they mean in your own experience, that's a great facility for our practice and inquiry. So Sea of Platitude says, if there is no entity or ego, what gets reincarnated? Yeah, so this is often a question. So in the early Buddhist language, the word that is used is rebirth. And so it's not a someone, it's not an entity being reincarnated, which means getting into an entity, finding another body. And yet, what's talked about, a term that gets used is mind stream or stream of consciousness, which is a conditioned process. So when the Buddha's asked about the cause of rebirth, he says ignorance, karma, and craving. Ignorance, karma, and craving are the things that propel a being to take birth, to find birth, to be reborn. So these processes of ignorance, the unseen processes, ignorance, karma, and craving. So they're influences, they're momentums in the mind stream that move in one direction, which is rebirth. Once ignorance has been uprooted, there is no more rebirth. Or as in the Tibetans say, no more karmic rebirth. So ignorance of all of these factors, ignorance specifically of the Four Noble Truths in all their aspects of how these play out, the ignorance of the khandhas, the clinging that is an aspect of these, of personality view, of identity view with regards to phenomena and conditions, ignorance about that. And that's why our meditation is all about inquiry, looking into, and understanding how to rest the mind, to see to create the calm, to support the insight, to undermine ignorance, basically. Is there a spiritual morality? There's definitely within Buddha-Dhamma, there's definitely morality as part of the path. When you say spiritual morality, I'm wondering if you're making a distinction between, say, cultural conditioning, which says this is right, this is wrong, and something born more of insight into the direct nature of reality. And so, yes, in that sense, the Buddha did point out this undying, well, this, let's say, I was thinking of this because of all the tragedy and wars in the world today. The Buddha quite clearly says, hatred is never appeased by hatred. Only by love is hatred appeased. This is the eternal law. An eternal law, it's a part of the fabric of our lives. It points to an underlying causal reality, the karmic reality or the causal reality. Hatred is never appeased by hatred. And we can see that, or those of us with eyes, a little dust in our eyes perhaps, can see that. And yet it keeps happening. Reprisal for hatred with hatred. And it keeps the whole thing going. When will it ever stop? Only when we say the buck stops here. I'm not going to react with hatred, more hatred, because it'll just keep coming round again and round again and round. So the spiritual morality the Buddha talked about as he encouraged us to keep the 5 precepts as at least the first 4 as a basic form of morality, but not just as precepts, to actually acknowledge. And when he talks to people, the Kalama Sutta in the collection of suttas, where the Buddha is visiting the people called the Kalamas in the village or city of Kalama, I guess. And they were saying they were confused because different spiritual teachers come through and say different things. They don't know what to believe in. And the Buddha said, yeah, that's right, that's true. So then he questioned them. He said, well, think about this. If someone goes around killing living beings, is that for the welfare of themselves or others, or does it not lead to their own welfare and the welfare of others? And they said, well, it doesn't lead to their welfare or the welfare of others. I said, right. And if they go around stealing or lying or committing sexual misconduct, does that lead to their welfare and the welfare of others or not? And they could clearly say, well, it doesn't lead to their welfare or the welfare of others. And he said, well, just so. When you know for yourselves what leads to welfare of yourself and others and what doesn't, so you should behave. Let go and refrain from behaving in ways that do not lead to your welfare or the welfare of others. And make much of the ways that do lead to your welfare and the welfare of others. So this, I would say, is a basic spiritual morality based on insight, based on actual causes and conditions, what leads to what, and something you can verify. We get so confused these days in our so-called sophisticated cultures. And it's just ego confusion, ignorance. There is a basic morality, and people often can't recognize it but it's usually because of the inflation of the ego reacting in one way or the other. But the more we can model this and point this out, people can recognize the basic morality that makes us worthy of being called human, at least, rather than saying we're human because we fail. We can say we're human because we recognize we have a sense of care. We recognize the difference between suffering and not suffering, and the causes of suffering and the causes of non-suffering. And we can actually direct our intention to cultivate welfare and let go of that which doesn't lead to welfare. This I would call a level of human. And and to a large degree, it's natural. You could say it's conditioned, but I feel it goes beyond a conditioned aspect. It's an intuitive understanding. And Buddha talks about, the true Brahman, this is the true realized being, does not create harm. They have the clarity and understanding to see the pointlessness of it, and that it's just pointless suffering. So that's my opinion. Yeah. Thanks, Marion. I'm glad that hit the spot for you. So Alex says, it seems like a lot of thinking and investigating to go through all of what you explained. Can't we be there by dropping thought altogether? Yes, Alex. Drop thought altogether and be there. That will work too. Now, in terms of the models that I explained, it does sound like a lot because these are not something that we're culturally conditioned by, and so it takes a little bit of learning. And that, certainly in my experience, when I was starting out as a Buddhist practitioner, it sounded all very complex and mind-boggling. But now, having understood what they're pointing to, I just find it's a fantastic map that can be recognized in an instant. And the more you understand it, actually, the simpler it becomes. The Buddha's teachings can, like I said earlier in these series, it can be unfolded into a multifaceted, what appears like quite a complex interface of things. You can see a bit like Indra's net, all these different facets interfacing, or like this phenomenally huge faceted jewel that reflects so many different aspects. In that aspect, it can appear complex, but in its simplicity, it's just a jewel. And similarly, in the simplicity of the Four Noble Truths, it's like one taste, which is kind of what you're talking about. Can't we just be there by dropping thought? You can, but do it. See how long you can drop thought and stay there. Why is it that is not sustained or can't be sustained? It's because of these fetters and the clinging that's still there. So you have to start to see through the attachments and the clinging. And so these fetters are just indicators. They're just indicators of where the clinging is. Just like when Anuruddha, who was non-returner, went to Sariputta, who was Arahant, he asked him, I've got all these fantastic abilities, but my mind is still not released from clinging. And Sariputta pointed out, well, there's the clinging there, and there. So go away and have a look at that. And he did, and realized. So it's the delusion, the ignorance that's obscuring our mind, that we're not seeing where the clinging is. So in this sense, this is how these models, which are just indicators where to look in the mind, they're indicating experience to enable release. But please, if you can go there by dropping thought together, that's the direct route. Sadhu. What do you think about laymen like Daniel Ingram, who go about claiming they are an Arahant? Are they simply deluded? All the enlightened teachers seem to say that anyone going about claiming they're enlightened are usually deluded, which is kind of interesting. So even the enlightened teachers I'm referring to, I mean, these are teachers of old, you know, Longchenpa, Padmasambhava, the Buddha, even though, you know, even the Buddha's disciples, they didn't go about saying they were fully enlightened. And the Buddha actually had a rule about it as well, because unscrupulous monks would try to get support through saying they'd attained this, that, and the other. But for one who's really realized the thought of I no longer arises, or if it does, it's completely seen through as a conditioned moment, there's no one to claim anything. And yet they know clearly the mind is fully released, the heart is released. So even in the Buddhist suttas, you sometimes get the lion's roar happening, what they call a lion's roar, where someone is, without saying directly, I'm fully enlightened, someone is somehow has to declare that their mind is not inclined to samsara anymore. And in one such case was when Sariputta was, one of the monks got kind of jealous and started saying that Sariputta did some unscrupulous things. And a meeting was called amongst the Sangha to see what was true and what was not. And Sariputta gave a talk and actually said, my mind can no longer incline towards, you know, these things, greed, hatred, or aversion. So without saying he was fully enlightened, he was saying, actually, my mind couldn't have done these things. And upon hearing that talk, the monk who accused him actually confessed and said, sorry, you know, I asked forgiveness, I've done the wrong thing. So that was considered a lion's roar by Sariputta. Yeah, so yeah, I don't know Daniel Ingram personally, but often this can happen. You know, people can also be a little bit deluded. They may have some stage of awakening and think that they're fully awakened. That can happen a lot, and that is also somewhat enabled because different traditions can have different models of awakening, or what they call awakening. So it's not always easy. But within this tradition, within early Buddhism, this is why it's got a very, very clear model of what is awakening and what stage of awakening. So one can discern for oneself what's going on. One, you know, with right insight, even so, one might still be deluded, but with spiritual friends, they can point out where they're still clinging, which is so helpful to have spiritual friends. Great, so people are saying that they enjoyed the teaching. Judd started meditating journey in 97 with 𝐀𝐭𝐭𝐬𝐬 under the 16th Karmapa. This is perfect in the easy manner within which one can share. Thank you. Great. Do you think that pleasure is to be avoided at all cost in order to realize the truth? No. We can get quite confused about sense pleasure, and I speak from my own experience. When the Buddha talks about clinging to sense pleasure, because pleasure happens in relation to sense experience, there's both pleasure and pain. There's that which is unpleasant, that which is pleasant, along the whole spectrum, and that which is neutral. So encouragement is to get to know it, to know the feeling tone. What is this feeling of pleasure? What is this feeling of pain? What is this feeling of neither pleasure nor pain? It is a moment, it is a feeling tone, is an experience or an aspect of experience. It's an aspect of experience, of conscious experience. So just get to know the flavor so as you're aware of it and aware of what happens when a pleasant feeling arises. What happens in the mind. This is where you can see craving and clinging arising. So craving, in the law of dependent origination, the experience of craving can only arise upon a feeling tone, whether it's pleasant, painful, or neutral. Without recognizing feeling tone, we often can't recognize how craving arises and how clinging arises upon craving. So this is important territory to see. If we start trying to avoid the pleasant and, I don't know, avoid the unpleasant, or, we're getting into this thing of, you're almost in that territory where certain spiritual practitioners in the Buddha's day were more into self-mortification because they thought that somehow exhausted the bad karma, the unwholesome karma, and I guess wanted to avoid any pleasant experiences, thinking that would be not good. But the Buddha is asking us to contemplate, because there's pleasure and pain in all of experience. So we need to just understand what it is. So you'll find this within the foundations of mindfulness. It's a second foundation of mindfulness, to study, to observe feeling tone, how it arises and how it ceases. Yeah, in a contemplative way. But the Buddha does suggest a middle way when it comes to sensual pleasure, to moderation with eating and sleeping, with sexual pleasures, to contain it within appropriate sexual behavior, i.e. to avoid sexual misconduct. So if you're with one partner, be honorable with one partner, consenting partners, and always compassionately, not selfishly. So, but also just being aware of how pleasure can intoxify and how clinging, wanting more of it, and how it can become addictive, to become aware of this and how it works, to see how if there's just the habitual being caught in compulsion, it leads to addiction, which brings a lot of other kind of sufferings with it. So the practice of moderation and investigation. Yeah, so, if we had to avoid pleasure at all costs to realize the truth, I'm not sure we would. I mean, the Buddha talked about not just understanding pleasure and pain, but remember in my talk, he talked about, the pleasure, the kind of pleasure that transcends sense pleasure is the pleasure of the mind in meditation, the refined pleasures. So these, whilst we have to see through the clinging there, they're almost used as stepping stones. It's very hard to abandon attachment to sensual pleasure when we don't yet know a pleasure that transcends it, a place to rest the mind. Yeah, so this is interesting contemplation. But one has to go beyond that clinging eventually too. But the pleasure of nibbana, the pleasure of the full realization of the deathless, is talked about, the pleasure that goes beyond feeling, but it is the highest happiness, the highest peace. So I recently finished my first 10-day course of Vipassana. 7th day, I felt a glimpse of immense peace, but I'm feeling very depressed, like no motivation to do anything. Please help. Okay, so that's good. You saw and you experienced immense peace. So this didn't sustain. It's an impermanent feeling. So all feelings, even peace and equanimity, are to be seen. Yeah, they stay for some time, but they are momentary experiences. So that's okay. That's their nature. So similarly to this feeling of depression, so this is also a feeling of the unpleasant kind. So you can, I mean, it may be related to, I can't give a completely comprehensive answer here, but to inquire into what is this depressed feeling. We use this word depression, but what is it? Investigate. Is it a sensation? Is it an emotion? Is it a feeling tone? Is it connected to a particular way of thinking or memory? Often, if we're feeling depressed, there's no motivation, no energy, so that can go together. So don't be too, I encourage you not to be too disturbed. Don't feel like you're stuck there, even though depression can feel like you're stuck there, but inquire into it. And it's okay to let it go. It is what it is in the moment. If you're something in you, often with unpleasant feeling, the clinging is the not wanting. This subtle and sometimes more gross pushing it away. I don't want this, I can't bear it, I don't like it. So here are the thoughts which are expressive of the clinging, not wanting. Clinging is not just wanting, it's not wanting as well, or craving, the craving to not have. So this is what often keeps unpleasant states in place and in play. So if you can see that not wanting as a moment of pushing away or craving, vibhava tanha, not wanting, wanting to get rid of, and relax that, something can transform. And it can be instantaneous. So I hope that helps. And just to point you to our website, vivekahermitage.com, where you'll find some guided meditations to help move through that territory, called Embodying Awareness and Kindness. And plenty of other meditations there that might help too. Okay, I think I understand, but I can't stop clinging to thoughts and ideas. Well, that's just the I. If you see the I, and thoughts as thoughts, momentary, ideas, momentary, just see their momentariness, and clinging is undermined. You don't have to stop clinging. Clinging is undermined through seeing clearly the impermanence, the changeability, the insubstantiality of all that arises. I've heard of spontaneous awakenings. It seems that knowledge of the steps towards awakening are not necessary. Well, that's true. That's true. Similarly, as I said, some of the early stories say of Sariputta's awakening and Moggallana's awakening. They didn't know the stages, of course, but they heard the truth. Their wisdom mind was ripe to fully understand. They gained insight. So that's absolutely true. You don't need to know these stages of awakening. I'm just putting it out there as a model because it's there within the early Buddhist teachings in the suttas. And as you saw in some of those stories, it does help clarify for practitioners who are at a certain stage to help reflect on, direct their mind to see the clinging. That's all. But if insight can arise at any point, whether in meditation or not, whether listening to Dharma talk or not. So the precursors for insight is understanding, recognizing impermanence and insubstantiality of all conditioned phenomena. So this seems to be the minimum precursors. Now, how that comes about, whether through your own contemplations or through hearing a teaching, it depends. It could be either way. Marian, I don't understand why there would be various worlds, and the Zen I've studied doesn't talk about them. Yeah. So yeah, Zen is paired a kind of a practice that is pared back quite a lot, which is great. Kind of cuts through a lot of things. The various worlds in the Buddhist cosmology, various planes of rebirth. So these get talked about quite a lot in the suttas, in terms of explaining karma, samsara, and I guess those two pretty much. And worlds, there we talk more of realms because ultimately they're all the mind. The mind is the forerunner of all conditioned states. So this is teaching the Buddha. So realms, all conditioned worlds or realms or experiences are mind created. Yeah. Karmically formed and constructed within mind in the large sense. So realms we can talk about. And one way we can recognize that, you don't have to have direct psychic powers and insights, but just looking in our own life, how many mind states we can move through, not only in one life, but in one day sometimes. The different realms, moods we can inhabit depending on what the mind is constructing. We might be reminded by something that happens of a painful time in our life, and we start thinking about everything that happened then. Before you know it, we've got the same emotions and mind states arising, and we're feeling sad and confused about what happened in the past. We've moved into a realm, mind-created realm, which we could say is tinged with suffering. Similarly, one can think of a wonderful time in one's life, and all the thoughts and feelings, emotions come in to support that, and you might experience a heavenly state. In fact, there is a Zen story that illustrates this. I remember the teacher in one of my first meditation retreats told this story, maybe from the Chinese Zen tradition. I'm not sure if it's Chinese or Japanese tradition, but there's this great sage, and a warrior king came to know about this great sage, and he went to him and said to him, "Teach me about heaven and hell. Teach me about enlightenment." And he's quite a threatening kind of character, this warrior king. He's there with his sword and all these horsemen, and this humble little sage, meditating sage, said, "I'm not going to teach you a thing," and said some rather rude words to him. And this warrior king was so enraged, he pulled his sword and he was about to behead the monk. And the monk said to him, "That's hell." And the warrior king was so stunned at the power of this truth that this monk had pointed out. And he had this immense gratitude arising. He dropped his sword, he fell to his knees, and he bowed and he asked forgiveness and thanked the monk for his teaching. And the monk said, "That's heaven." So you can get this powerful teachings in very direct ways. So depression has many aspects to it. I suffer from it too. That's right. I'm going to be putting up some guided meditations soon, and one deals directly with depression. Guided meditations and reflections. One on anger, anxiety, depression, fear and desire, and grief. Set of 5. So I hope they'll be helpful. Someone asked, how do we live with no thought? Maybe you should ask Alex. Was it Alex who brought that up? Just having a go, Alex. There's thought and there's thought. There's conditioned thought. Well, actually, all thought is conditioned. And even the Buddha thought to do this or to do that. But he knew thought as thought and was not taken in by thought. He knew what was worth acting on and not worth acting on. So we live with the khandhas. We live with form, feeling, perception, mental formation, sense consciousness. But as we come to know them just for what they are, we live without clinging to them. And we clearly see what's worth acting on and not. How to find a teacher and finally relinquish ignorance and pleasure. Well, as I said before, you don't have to relinquish, well, push away pleasure anyway. Relinquishing is not clinging, so that's true. Let's listen to Dharma teachings, John. There's so many on the internet these days. Listen again and again and again. If there's no teacher in your vicinity, that's okay. There's plenty of teachers around these days. There's so much Dharma you can access. Listen to the Dharma, practice the Dharma, and trust that your own inner teacher, your own inner guide, which is the wisdom, developing wisdom faculty, will guide you. And follow up on what's arising in your practice in terms of what's interesting you at the time, because there the energy, the interest will be. So if you listen to the early parts of these sessions, look into the Four Noble Truths. How to finally relinquish ignorance? You have to come to know what is suffering. In your own experience, suffering is a signpost. Where do you suffer in your life? Look there. Be with that. Where's the clinging? How can you be with that in a way that lets go, doesn't cling? This is where the teaching is. This is where the teacher is. The Buddha said, if one sees the Dharma, one sees me. If one sees me, one sees the Dharma. He said, even if you cling to my robe and follow me around everywhere, if you don't see the Dharma, you don't see me. But someone who lives leagues away and has never seen me, if they see the Dharma, they see me. Very powerful. And what did the Buddha see? He saw the Four Noble Truths in all their aspects, the third being the ending of suffering, Nibbana. There to be seen here and now. but it takes some investigation. Suffering, that first noble truth, needs to be understood. Craving, the cause of suffering, needs to be abandoned. Nibbana, the end of suffering, needs to be realized. The path, the way, the practice needs to be cultivated. These are the tasks of the Four Noble Truths. At what point is the raft, the religion of Buddhism, to be left behind? And what does that look like? It's left behind at Arahantship. The Buddha talked about using the raft to get across the sea of samsara, or the river of samsara. Use the raft. It's not necessarily the religion of Buddhism. He talked about building a raft on this shore out of the sticks and the twigs, the things that are found on this shore, and using it to get across the stream of samsara. Once across, once you've fully realized. He just said it's no point carrying that raft around on your shoulder. So it doesn't mean one doesn't necessarily, particularly as a monastic, that doesn't mean one disrobes, doesn't mean one stops following, observing precepts or practicing, or even stops meditating. It's just not clinging. It's not clinging to the raft, seeing the raft as the means. So yes, even the Buddha's teaching is a means. It's a conditioned paradigm. It's a paradigm. They're concepts, they're pointings, they're words. But all of these things function as indicators to help our minds build the raft, find that way to cross the shore of suffering, of confusion. Once confusion is abandoned or dispelled, once ignorance is uprooted, the work's done. What does it look like? It looks like freedom, but it doesn't mean the outer container doesn't still live an upright, noble life. Do you have any advice to continue Dhamma practice when one is weary and distracted? Just notice weariness and distraction, their experiences. So what are they? What kind of experiences are they? When we notice what's happening, that's our Dhamma practice. When we see conditions for what they are, that's our Dhamma practice. When we know, recognize awareness, see conditions arising and ceasing with awareness, that's our Dhamma practice. Weariness is weariness, distraction is distraction. Is that an I, a me, a mine? It's callous. It's momentary phenomena. I practice alone in a city where it's difficult to find fellow practitioners. In a city, usually in a city somewhere, there will be some kind of meditation group. But as I said to someone earlier, you can also find your Sangha online these days too. There's so many resources, so do make use of that. So we're coming up to a time where I should stop. I'm just going to try and find the questions through here. Wanting peace, not wanting war, is this clinging? It can be indeed. It is. Of course, war is war, peace is peace, but we can know the way to peace and the way of war. Okay. Excuse me while I just scrolling through. There's lots of comments here. Perspective on devils. A question here about perspective on devils and demons. Someone says, I get the impression that sustaining the recognition of the nature of mind is very difficult to maintain during a whole day. Is it not a denial of our biology to try to constantly be empty? Well, it's not really trying. It's not about trying to be empty. It's just about recognizing, and awareness itself, just seeing its ever-present reality. It's not denying biology, but just seeing clearly. Yeah. So, all getting to know biology as biology, awareness is awareness, and the non-separation of the two. So I'm going to leave it to there today, folks, because we're coming up to 2.5 hours, and I'm sorry if I didn't get to your question. I really am. A lot of what was there were also comments. If you'd like to look at the Q&As on our website, sometimes, we pick out the Q&As from coming in through different media that will speak to a lot of people's questions. So you might find some responses there on our website that are helpful. In the meantime, thank you for joining me today. And in 6 weeks' time will be the last series, the last session in this series. And I'm going to talk more about the conditioned and the unconditioned, or samsara and nibbana, as it's often put, as the last session. And I hope to see you there. So please take care and be well. Much love. Bye for now.